transformation is not just about developing a strategy, it's about taking action and implementing that strategy. Without implementation, strategy holds no value. These are the words from guest today, Adam Bennett. And what he's getting at here is that action is one of the key things that we need to, as leaders, ensure we go after. Because without action, no matter the plans or the vision, the strategy, what have you, it's just a dream. It's just up in the air. Action is what drives to results. And inspiring, motivating, coordinating, communicating all different types of things with our team, that is what's going to drive and get those results. So that's our guest today. That's the type of topic we get into, as well as we talk about a whole slew of topics, such as how transformation involves disruption, strategy, and action, why there's resistance to change, how to agree, ask, change, remove obstacles, and keep going, why executives listening, you executives listening, need to avoid arrogance and rather focus on the essentials, how leaders must commit to the change to be successful in transformation, some key roles in transformation at the strategic and operational levers, how to prioritize your strategies, align them, and keep them on track, why urgency and transparency are required for transformation, and how come great leaders achieve objectives constructively and positively. This is what you're getting out of today's episode, ladies and gentlemen. You're getting transformation, you're understanding why change is so important, yet you're also getting how action is absolutely crucial in achieving all of this and just so much more. And with that, I'm going to get to it. So why don't you sit back, relax, and join my conversation with Adam Bennett, all about the transformation journey. Welcome one, welcome all to the Peak Performance Leadership Podcast, a weekly podcast series dedicated to helping you hit peak performance across the three domains of leadership, those being leading yourself, leading your team, and leading your organization. This podcast couples my 20 years of military experience as a senior Canadian Army officer with world-class guests to bring you the most complete podcast of leadership going. And for more, feel free to check out our website at movingforwardleadership.com. And with that, let's get to the show. Adam, sir, welcome to the show. So good to have you here today.
Thanks, Scott. It's great to be here.
So we're just finished talking about weather, sports, and all good stuff differences between Canada and Australia. But I love having you Australians on the show because it's a very, I feel like we have a commonality, but yet different perspective on things. So it's just nice to have Aussies on the show with me.
Oh, fantastic.
Love it. So today we're talking about change and transformation, because Lord knows we need to talk about it because it's ever happening. I would love to start off from your perspective right out of the gate. What is transformation exactly in the first place?
Well, I think transformation is the combination of three important elements. So number one, there is some kind of disruption happening in the world or in your industry that is going to affect you or your organization. Number two, you have to then develop a corporate strategy in response to address those forces or pressures. And thirdly, and perhaps importantly, you have to actually take action and implement change. And so transformation for me is really about all three of those elements being present. And the third one, perhaps most importantly, because it's somewhat easy to develop a strategy, but we all know a strategy can sit on the shelf with nice paper, glossy graphs, and fantastic aspirations. But unless something actually happens, it's really not worth anything. So transformation has to have all three.
I love the last part. You actually have to take action. Like, I don't know how many times I've discussed that, and actually literally just finished recording a podcast talking a bit about that. And in my opening comments, because I was talking about vision and importance of having vision, because I was like, you know what, it's time to kind of revisit the basics, because we haven't revisited the basics, and I find we need a good reminder every now and then. And I opened with the quote, I don't know who said it, but a vision without action is just a dream. And that's much like a transformation, right? It's just a strategy. Just, it's paperweight sitting there.
Yeah, I'm familiar with that quote. It's a Japanese adage, and it's I think it's strategy. Execution without strategy is also a nightmare. So it becomes this. You need to know where you're going, and you then need to know how you're going to get there. And I think of it in terms of the means and the ends. And the ends is what you want to do and achieve, and the means is then how you're going to get there.
Right. Absolutely. Now, tying off of that, and I'm sure you've heard this, when I talk to clients, I get it all the time, and they talk about change, transformation, and they just go, it's just so difficult. Why is it so difficult? Like, we have such a hard time implementing this and getting people on board. So from your perspective, like, why is it difficult, or why do people perceive it to be difficult?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it's not only difficult now, I think it's always been difficult, and it's been well recognized that it's been difficult. And one of my favorite quotes, I'll maybe kind of say the quote and we can talk about where it came from, but the quote is this: and one must bear in mind that there is nothing more difficult to execute, dubious of success, or dangerous to administer than to introduce a new way of doing things. For he who does so has enemies of all those who profit from the existing way of doing things, and only lukewarm allies in all who may profit from the new. And that quote was written in 1532 by Niccolo Machiavelli. And so I think it's been recognised throughout history that the change is difficult. And I think it's difficult for three reasons. Number one is the status quo never has to argue its own case. So the status quo just basically sits there and plods along, adds a little bit more weight each year, a bit like rings of a tree, and nothing happens until someone or something forces change. So, in many companies, the status quo is the only option with momentum. Number two, I think there's a whole heap of corporate elements that reinforce business as usual, and that could be how organizations perceive the outside world or not. It could be how they budget. It could be how they set their capital budgets, their scorecards. It could be their culture. It could be some of the unwritten assumptions that exist in the mindsets of those people. It could be how they manage talent. So there's a whole heap of corporate elements that make transformation difficult. But most importantly, I think it's difficult because of people and corporate personalities. And I think there are a number of personalities that resist change, and they do so for what they probably think are rational reasons. And they're, personalities like the loser, for example, who will lose their power and prestige or, role from the change, and therefore they resist it. Or it might be, the traditionalist who can't imagine their industry working any other way than the way it's always worked. It could be the autocrat who just wants to tell everyone what to do. It could be the defender who just wants to defend how everything works now. Or it could be the rationalist who just does what's in their scorecard. And if their scorecard is not aligned to the transformation, then they could well be busy taking the organization left when the strategy is saying go right. So I think there's a whole heap of elements that make it difficult.
Those different personality types, I really liked how you laid them out, and you kind of just gave a brief explanation of them. Do you got any advice out there how to deal with those types?
Yeah, I think Well, I think I would start by being really clear on what you want to achieve, and I think that's where hence the three elements of transformation. And secondly, I think communicating what you want to do in a compelling and simple manner right off the start. And I think then, as the leader, you have to then assess where are the people in your organization and who is going to put their shoulder to the wheel of the transformation. And I would look for two things. One is the people with the right temperament and the right mindset for transformation, i.e., they're open, they're curious, they're collaborative, they want to work with others, and they've got the right skill sets, i.e., they're good at getting things done, they understand the industry, they understand business process and technology and change and project management, all those types of things. So I think I'd start with that. But if you then run into corporate personalities that resist the change, I think the first thing is to one, acknowledge it and actually name it and actually say, right, that person in that business unit is just not up for this. And then I think you're faced with a choice. If you imagine a scale, how important is that individual and the role they play in the organization compared to, if there's an existential threat to the organization, the customers, employees, the shareholders, et cetera, of all of that organization weighed up, and you say, right, well, something's got to give. Now, that person may be able to get on board or they may not. And if they can't, it's probably best for both them and the company that you part ways and they got to go.
I really enjoyed the clear communication about it, and especially the labeling aspect of it. Are you familiar with author? Oh God, I'm having a brain fart moment. The author, Chris Voss, author of Never Split the Difference.
No, I've heard of the book, but I've heard the title, but I'm not familiar with it.
Chris Voss, it's a great book. I have actually a copy here somewhere in my office. I need to actually break it out and read it again, but he talks about labeling emotions and stuff in communication. It's very similar along those lines when we're communicating and we want the other kind of like get the other side to understand. But you want to come across as being empathetic to them. You label like, oh, you seem quite stressed about this upcoming change. Tell me more. So communicating with them in that type of manner is kind of how Chris would go about it, but very similar to what you're getting at.
Yeah, I agree. I'd ask people directly, where do you stand? And, I think tales of redemption are awesome, but if someone can't get behind the change, then, I should have kept the white ant for longer, said no one ever. If someone's just going to be an obstacle and white ant the whole transformation because they don't believe in it or it's going to pressure them, then they got to go. And that doesn't mean you don't treat them fairly and kindly and all that kind of stuff, but you've got to keep moving. And I also subscribe that graveyards are full of indispensable people, so somehow the organisation will make it without them.
No one is irreplaceable.
Yeah, 100%.
Right. No one's irreplaceable, and that goes against what I often say is like, I wouldn't say rule number one, but up there in one of the top rules of always be humble, be subscribe to humility, because at the end of the day you are replaceable, and for the leaders listening, at the end of the day you're going to leave the organization one way or another. No one stays forever.
Yeah, the key question is, in what shape do you leave it?
Right, and I would argue that most people would hope to leave it in a better state than when they got there. That would be the goal. That's how 100%. I practice. That's actually that's what you want to strive to achieve. So with that, we're talking about change and transformation here. Where do you think the leader's mindset needs to be when they're facing this potential crisis that you might have, this massive transformation that's ongoing, that is about to be launched in their company? How does one within their headspace get prepared or align their thought processes?
Yeah, I think mindset is really critical. And I think one of the things you've already mentioned there is humility. And I'd say with humility and curiosity, because you want to have some intellectual doubt. I think if you enter a transformation, or if you enter the development of strategy with a view that you know everything, I think that's a very dangerous premise on which to start developing strategy. And if you look at the world now, I mean, the world is changing so fast, and we all know this. We all know that the pace of change is accelerating, and there's a whole heap of forces at play. And so if you enter it thinking that you know it all, I think that's quite dangerous. And there's a concept in Japanese martial arts called shoshin, which is beginner's mind. And I think that's a really good metaphor for executives to keep in mind when they are looking at the world. Don't look at it through the lens as though you know it all. And I think this can be a bit of a trap because if you think about strategy, it's typically done by the most senior people in a company. And those most senior people in the company have typically grown up in that industry or that company. And it's very easy for them to self-identify as experts and to think that they have all the answers. And, some of them will also, they'll kind of claim they've been there 20 years, but what they've maybe got is 1 year 20 times. And they're two very different things. So I think entering the development of strategy and being sensitive to what's going on in the world with a degree of humility is really important. And then I'd add to that kind of, being, really clear on what is the essence of what you need to do for your company to be successful. Find that essence, that one or two things, and then focus all your attention on that. And I always subscribe it's better to move one or two things forward a mile than 50 things forward an inch. And so what are those one or two things? And then get at them with urgency, with ambition. Have an ambition for the scale of the transformation. Do it urgently. Maintain a sense of humor and some resilience, because it's going to be tough to transform an organization. And get over yourself a bit. Think about it through the lens of what you're doing for others and for the company. And I think all of those things will have a good mindset for getting the transformation off to a great start.
I really like the last little bit there. The last words you basically said, get over yourself. And you mentioned earlier about how a lot of senior executives see themselves as the experts, right? And that they have all the answers. And what I've been saying to leaders now for a while now, we're in a day and age where it's not about having the answers anymore. It's about asking the right questions.
Yep. Yeah, 100%. I think leadership has always been about that. Leadership, in my view, is about creating space for others to step into. And if you don't create that space because you're full of your own ideas, or your own ideas, the only ones that ever get talked about, then you're not creating space for others to step into. And I think when you do that, you're inevitably surprised on the upside by just how much people will bring. And that's the role of a leader, is to create an environment, not to have all the answers.
Awesome, man. So we've discussed, what transformation is from your perspective. You talked about some different corporate personality types and how to kind of get around them per se. We talked a bit about mindset here and now. I'd like to get into the nuts and bolts of transformation and change from your perspective. Like, for the leaders out there, like, what does that process actually look like? Starting to going through and getting to the end of whatever it is they're after.
Yeah, so I would put it down to what I call five mechanics. So if we've discussed the mindset, this kind of moves us into the mechanics of how do you do this? And I think they're not really. Well, I certainly don't intend them to be like done in a linear fashion. But imagine it's like a checklist for, if you were sailing a sailing ship, you're continually checking the sails and the rudder and where the wind is, and you're trimming the sails, all that kind of stuff. So these are 5 things to do in similar fashion. Number 1, I would say, is personal commitment. And that's the personal commitment of the leader to get out in front and actually be the actual and symbolic owner of the transformation, and give people a sense that the person leading this can't be successful unless it's successful, unless the change is successful. And this, of course, brings up a big debate for for CEOs and senior executives of how much time should they dedicate to a change program as opposed to dedicate to running the business as usual. And running the business as usual is perhaps less risky than running a transformation. And again, if there's disruptive forces at play, running the business as usual is important. But if those forces play out, then the organization may not exist anymore. So when you look at it through that lens, you'd say most of their time should be spent on the transformation, and they should be delegating as much of the BAU as they can. What I've seen sometimes is it's the opposite. The leader wants to delegate the transformation piece and maintain the leadership of the BAU. Both are important, but they're different. And I think that's something for people to think about. Number two is the leader must make a choice. And, strategy is about choice. And no organization can do everything. Even a massive multinational corporate will run out of capacity. Even if they don't run out of money, they'll run out of capacity in terms of, how many people they can deploy. Sometimes you just can't get another mechanic around the hood of the engine in the car. There's just not room. You can't do any more. And so companies need to kind of focus and make hard choices. And I think that's where it can become very difficult because all organizations have competing priorities. And we even call them priorities, whereas my preference would be to rank your priorities, because it's easy to have 3, 4, 5 high priorities. But if you say, what is number one? What is number two? What is number three? It forces the somewhat uncomfortable choices and discussion around what is more important than the other. So that's number two, make a choice and also be able to communicate that choice. So have a compelling case for change. And I think if you are relying on a 30-page PowerPoint deck to communicate your strategy, you're in a bit of trouble. So I think you should literally be able to communicate it in a compelling way in a couple of sentences. And those sentences could be as easy as, because of A, B, and C, we are now doing X, Y, and Z. And that's a very easy thing to articulate, but it sometimes takes a lot of effort to distill it down to what it is you're going to do. And if you then add another sentence, and we're going to do it by this time, and so-and-so is going to lead it, then you're pretty much off to a good start in communicating the strategy in a way that people in the organization will be able to relate to, because it's simple. Number three, I would say you've got to build the right team. And I spoke before about, people with the right temperament, people with the right skills, and then also being very much aware of those people who could be obstacles or resist the change. And there's also a couple of what I would call fulcrum roles around which the entire transformation will move. And that could be someone who's running a certain business unit or a certain function or doing certain work, which is the main kind of playground of the transformation. And if you've got the right people in those roles, then you're off to a good start. Then number four, I would say be thorough. And be thorough in two aspects. One is, understand the levers of change that you can pull at various times to take action. And there are strategic levers such as your products and your services, your customers, your markets. There might be alliances you can form. There might be a platform you can build. So there's some very strategic levers you can pull. But then most of the hard work will be around what I would call the operational levers. And that's things like business process, organization structure, technology, people and culture, facilities, outsource providers. So by pulling all those levers simultaneously, you're likely to get a good result. And then you've also got to make sure that result is going to lead to shareholder value. So it can't just be, we're going to improve the organization. So being specific about what you want to do and how you make create value is important. And last is keep score. Use KPIs to regularly align and keep score and be objective about what it is you're doing. It can't be, we improved the company. It's got to be, we did something very specific, and you can show the from to story to show how it works. So there are 5 things I would suggest are good mechanics to use.
Those are very, very logical, but yet I would say concise, but yet comprehensive at the same time. Like you've nailed, in my mind, you've nailed them all. I like the part you talked about when you talked about priorities. And you said, okay, you got to pick one or two, because often where I find myself, coaching and advising and stuff, like, yeah, that's a priority. This is a priority. That's a priority. Yes, this is a priority. Well, guess what? If everything's a priority, nothing
is.
right?
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, it's an interesting thing. So I used to work for one of the big Australian banks, and in Australia, I guess like Canada, they're quite outsized organisations in terms of their size, relative size to other companies in the economy. And so I looked after a bank's investment slate, which was $1.5 billion a year. And it was interesting because you think that's a big number. So you immediately assume there must be lots of money to go around. And what I found interesting was by the time you looked at the regulatory projects, you looked at the technology refresh and capacity projects, the projects that were in flight from last year, that number very quickly got down to a very small number. And I would say the leadership of the organization were less like lions looking at a kind of African prey animal and more like seagulls on a chip. So what was left, they were all trying to get the small part of the slate that was left. And if you think about it, and this is a very easy thing any organization can do, if your strategy is clear, I would suggest you explain that as a pie chart. So if there's three elements, there might be three elements to the strategy, and you say, well, relatively, what does that look like as a pie chart with 100% divided by what you want to do as a pie chart? Now, have a look at your investment slate and see where the money is going by percentage and compare the two. And inevitably, they will be very different. So what's interesting is what you think is the strategy, i.e. the first part you did, actually the strategy is where you're spending your money. That is what the priority is. And I think there's a couple of things to just drive hard-nosed decisions. So again, as we discussed, like don't have all your priorities, rank them. What is number one? What is number two? What is number three? What is number four? Because unless you do that, at some point deep in the bowels of it could be the technology team, someone's going to decide where a testing analyst is going to work on Monday, and they may actually send them to one of the projects because that suits them, but they're actually then setting the priority of the organization rather than, actually let's get number one done. So I think, having that alignment and then really be rigorous about how you're going on them and where they are. And again, I'd suggest, when you're reporting on them and, looking at dashboards and stuff, just use red or green. Don't use amber. So it's either on track or it's not. And, by the introduction of amber, it brings this ambiguity and this kind of, it's almost complacency that, oh, well, it's amber, And how many times have we seen something amber for a long time and then suddenly it's red? And you can actually it was always
out.
Red. Yeah, it was always red. You didn't know it was red. So it's like if it's green, you're doing it. If not, it's red. Let's have that hard conversation.
I really like that, because I find it gives people an out, and then it's just an excuse for mediocrity, right? It's like, no, it's I like that ideology of we're either on track or we're off track, and if it's off track, then let's have the conversation now about how we get it back on track. Bad news is not like wine; it doesn't get better with age.
100%. Well, I used to say, bad news should take the elevator. Good news should take the stairs.
Right. And then I think the problem is that it's still a lot of the old school ideology of bringing bad news. Therefore, I'm going to look bad. I'm going to get the blame and all this stuff. Whereas, like, no, just separate the two. Separate the person who's bringing the bad news and the bad news themselves. Don't think of it as their performance or their capabilities, because most likely, if you've done your job right, through your steps, you picked your team. You're the one that's responsible at the end of the day because you're the one that picked that person to be there. Now, I doubt that they've done something completely outrageous that, like, why would you do such a thing? Like, so the moral of the story is that people show up at the end of the day or the beginning of the day looking to do a good job. They don't wake up and go, I wonder how I'm going to mess up work today.
Yeah, they just don't. They just don't. And I think if you've got a team of people, it's ironic that when you're looking at your team, you most trust and you most, so I certainly do. I most trust those people who bring me their issues and say, hey, I'm jumping on my sword. This has happened. I feel that they are far more effective, far better leaders than someone who's unwilling to do that. So when you're looking downwards, you really like that. Although when you're looking upwards, you can sometimes feel like, God, I better not say how badly, So it's got this kind of dual, the person looking down is welcoming that if they're a good leader, and the person looking upwards should be saying, yeah, I've got to tell them what's really going on. And that environment of trust and, realism, I think, is what's required for transformation far more than BAU, because in transformation, it's so much more urgent and transparent. And transformation as a result, I think, it's different. It's different to running business as usual because there's an urgency and a transparency that is just not the same as BAU, and you can easily calculate the burn rate and the costs associated with a transformation project. So you better be getting at it and delivering something, whereas the BAU sometimes is not under the same scrutiny.
Adam, this has been an awesome, just fantastic conversation, sir. Truly enjoyed it. I enjoyed your insights and everything you've brought to the show today. As we're up here, we've got a couple last questions for you. First being a question I asked all the guests here at the Peak Performance Leadership Podcast, and that's according to you, Adam Bennett. What makes a great leader?
I think there are two things that make a great leader. Number one is they can actually get something done and achieve their objectives. And secondly, they can do so in a way that brings their people on that journey in a constructive and positive way. But I think, it's very easy to think that the latter is most important, but I think they're both equally important. If not, you have to achieve what you set out to achieve. It's no use just being a nice person that everyone really likes, but you can't get anything done. So leadership is about achieving your objectives and doing so in a really positive, constructive manner.
Awesome. Love it. Absolutely love it. And finally, sir, how can people find you, follow you, be part of your journey? Shameless plug. Have at it.
Yeah, well, thank you. You can find me at Great Change Consulting. So www.greatchangeconsulting.com.au is my website. I've also written a book called Great Change, The Way to Get Big Strategy Done, which is published by Wiley and is available on Amazon. And there you can find me on those two places or LinkedIn. So Adam Bennett on LinkedIn.
Awesome.
And I'd love to chat. So
yeah, absolutely.
Sorry, you dropped out there.
Yeah, no, I'm going to have to edit that part out. All right, for the listener, always, it is easy. Just go to the show notes for this episode, which is always lead.boss/the episode number, and the link will be there. So, Adam, again, thanks for taking time out of your busy schedule, sir. Appreciate you, appreciate your time, and I'm sure the audience does as well.
Thanks very much for having me, Scott. It's been great to chat with you.
And that's a wrap for this episode, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for listening. Thank you for supporting the Peak Performance Leadership Podcast. But you know what you could do to truly support the podcast? And no, that's not leaving a rating and review. It's simply helping a friend. And that is helping a friend by sharing this episode with them if you think this would resonate with them and help them elevate their performance level, whether that's within themselves, their teams, or their organization. So do that. Help me, help a friend. Win-win all around, and hey, you look like a great friend at the same time. So just hit that little share button on your app and then feel free to fire this episode to anyone that you feel would benefit from it. Finally, there's always more. There's always more lessons around being the highest performing leader that you can possibly be, whether that's for yourself, your team, or your organization. So why don't you subscribe? Subscribe to the show via movingforwardleadership.com/subscribe. And until next time, lead, don't boss, and thanks for coming out. Take care now.